might be wondering, what's the difference between a speech delay and autism? And how do I know if my child qualifies as having either a speech delay or autism? In this video, I'm going to boil it down to a few key differences. And before we get started, a quick introduction for those of you who are new here. My name is Stephanie Keffer. I'm a licensed speech therapist with an expertise in early childhood. A speech delay or a language delay happens when a child develops their speech and language skills later than we would expect. And often, a child will not have delays in any other area of development, only speech and or language skills. Some common indicators of a potential speech delay or language delay would be a vocabulary size that's smaller than their peers or difficulty pronouncing some words. Whereas for autism, there are specific guidelines set out by the DSM-5 for all official mental and behavioral health diagnoses, which includes autism. The person evaluating your child will compare what they observe against these official guidelines in order to make or rule out a diagnosis of autism. In order to qualify for a diagnosis of autism, per the DSM-5, a child must have difficulties forming and understanding relationships, using nonverbal communication such as eye contact and body language, and difficulties sharing interest and engaging with others, which is called social emotional reciprocity. In addition to these three things, a child must show at least two of the four characteristics in order to qualify for a diagnosis of autism per the DSM-5. Repetitive motor movements. This could be lining up toys, using objects in the same way over and over, and repeating words or phrases, even lines from TV shows. Difficulties with change. Needing to stick to a strict routine, having a hard time transitioning, or needing to eat the same food every day. Highly restricted or fixated interest, a strong interest in one particular thing. Hyper or hypo reactivity to things in their environment, like being highly sensitive to sounds, textures, touch, or lights. I've also included a link to our Toddler Talk Characteristics of Autism checklist. This is a list of common observations from parents of young children with autism. Second, when it comes to a speech delay or a language delay, children are developing skills at a slower pace or a later age than we would expect, but in the same order we would anticipate. Children who are diagnosed with autism may learn some speech and language skills out of order. For example, they might repeat back lots of words or phrases before they understand what those words or phrases mean. One example of this would be repeating back a sentence they heard in a TV show without understanding what they're saying. The third difference is that children who are first identified as having a speech delay may later also be identified as having autism. And this is not always the case, but often children who have autism are first identified as a late talker because the first characteristic noticed by parents and caregivers is that a child isn't talking, whereas a child who receives a diagnosis of autism is less likely to be misidentified as having autism and only have a speech delay, because the criteria required for qualifying for a diagnosis of autism are much more specific and strict, as we mentioned earlier in this video. Whereas the criteria for a speech or language delay are quite vague and not specific. And before you go, I want to talk a little bit about how a speech delay or language delay and autism are diagnosed by professionals. I won't go into a ton of detail, but I will link our Toddler Talk blog post that discuss all of the different evaluations you may have in the notes below in case you are interested. A speech or language delay is diagnosed by a speech therapist during a speech and language evaluation that usually takes between 1 and 2 hours. In order to set up an evaluation to qualify for speech therapy, you would start by talking to your pediatrician if you'd like to go through your insurance company, or by calling your state's early intervention program to see what free resources may be available to you. I've linked the CDC website below where you can find your state's early intervention program in case you're interested. A developmental evaluation would be scheduled to explore if your child qualifies for an autism diagnosis. This evaluation usually takes several hours and might happen over the course of a few appointments. In order to set up a developmental evaluation, you can also talk to your pediatrician to go through your insurance or call your state's early intervention program, which also offers these evaluations. I've worked with and supported hundreds of families before, during, and after the evaluation process for both speech delay and autism. Something I always counsel families on is that even though the process is extremely draining, if and when your child qualifies for a diagnosis of a speech or language delay, and especially if they qualify for a diagnosis of autism, there are often many more resources and supports available to them afterwards. It's often much easier to access the programs and the professionals that can help support your child's individual needs if they receive a diagnosis. And remember, the professionals you work with are not judging or criticizing your child or you, even though it can feel that way sometimes. The goal is always to identify what difficulties your child may be having so we can connect you with the best resources and supports to help their individual needs. I hope you found this information helpful. I'm going to also include a list of links to trustworthy websites in the notes below that have lots of information about autism and young children in case you're interested in learning more. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again next time.